Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev, where today we continue working on our dodgeball game with roguelike elements. Now, last time we gave our players some friends in the form of CPU opponents. Their behavior was established based on the same code written for the player, only triggered through various other means, such as distance and basic random chance. And while not without its own bit of jank, the end result was something that could at least pass for a dodgeball game. Which means we can finally move on to the roguelite part of this Dodgeball Roguelite experiment. So today we will be adding the classes for our player to choose from. And to start, we'll be adding each class's special ability. And we'll expand on the class system down the road, but for now let's just make sure that the physics system will even allow for the addition of these special abilities. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been waiting for this since the start, so let's not waste any more time and get to the coding. First, we were going to need some enums to keep track of each class. Each class name refers to their ability rather than their play style. Anyway, with those added, it was back to the player code. A spacebar check would be our trigger into a bunch of switch cases. A few variables for the ability mechanics were added, and then it was on to our first class, the Agile. The Agile's ability is a dodge roll, so the case would set the direction of the dodge as well as start the ability's cooldown timer. Then, if an ability has been activated, another switch would come into play. So for the first few frames, force in the desired direction would be applied to the Agile. All ability variables would then be reset once the cooldown hits 0. And the results? Well, that's just too much force. Much better. And there we had it, our first ability was added in the form of a dodge roll, which would propel the player in the mouse's direction for a few frames. This ability will likely be tweaked in the future, specifically the dodge direction, cause dodging towards the mouse felt a little weird. Anyway, with the dodge roll done, it was on to the next class and ability. Up next was the Angry, with the ability to produce an AoE capable of knocking any and all balls away. This was done by simply checking for any nearby balls to the player and applying force in the opposite direction relative to the player. And to keep track of the necessary radius needed to affect nearby balls, a circle was drawn to the screen, which ended up with pretty explosive results. Balls would be viciously thrown away from the player upon usage of this ability, though again there are definitely some tweaks that could be made. Nonetheless, the Angry was done, so it was on to ability number 3. The third class is the Astute, with the ability to freeze all balls, which is pretty simple. Disable ball physics while the ability is in effect, then re-enable upon reset. And though it works just fine, out of all the abilities thus far, this one is definitely gonna need some tweaking. But for now, it did what we needed it to do, so it was on to the next class. And that is the Able, whose ability gives the player a temporary shield, thus negating any balls that may tag the player while active. So a check for the Able class was made to the ball collision code to do just that. Then the player was tinted blue while the shield was active. And the results were what was expected. Players hit by a ball would not reset the game if they were as blue as an ice cube, which meant that the Able's code was working just fine, so we could move on to class number 5. The Attent was next, which would require a new object, the Decoy. This decoy object would be spawned off screen, but would feature a function to set its properties based on provided arguments. This would allow the Attent to summon this decoy for a duration of time. Then, if the decoy is not off screen, the CPU would prioritize it over the player. Now, it may be hard to tell, but this would work just as needed based on the way that the CPU would snap the rotations. And speaking of which, the smooth rotation had to be removed because, for some odd reason, it would cause the player's facing directions to drift over time. I haven't been able to find a fix, so instant directional shifts would have to do for now. Anyway, with the decoy now working, it was on to our final class / ability. The Acute would require the player to select an enemy unit. This unit is then stored in the ability direction variable. That unit ID would then be referenced during the throwball event, deciding the direction that the ball is thrown. In other words, the Acute's ability is to lock on to a single CPU opponent, thus making the process of aiming and hitting an opponent easier. I don't know, this one was a last minute addition. Anyway, the Acute would round out the classes for this Dodgeball Roguelite experiment. And again, it's pretty evident that they'll need work. The plan was to add more, but given the circumstances, 6 abilities that weren't too outlandish seemed like the best approach. Again, the classes will differ more in the future, but that'll come in due time. But for now, we managed to build a base level of things to work on, which feels like a nice place to stop for now. Mostly because this is also the end of the session, which also means we've come to the end of this episode of Let's Dev. So remember to leave a like if you enjoyed the episode, subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already, and leave your thoughts on our progress in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.